we have in a more sophisticated form that one can already see primitive versions of among animals dealing skillfully with their environment. There's a cycle of perception and thought and action, followed by perception of the results of action, that lets us calibrate what we do to what's happening, to what we're making, to what differences we're making in our environment. And it's by thinking about that sort of skillful, practical interaction with our environment that we'll come to understand what knowing subjects and intentional agents really are, that we can then abstract notions of subject and object, of mind and world from.
Your philosophy is very important the role of the conceptual contents to determine the dimension of the normative. You argue that Kant and Hegel have a different approach to the question of the normative. Can you explain this difference and your point of view about the question of the conceptual content in these two classical thinkers?
Well, Kant's great insight is that we're fundamentally normative creatures, that the difference between knowers and intentional agents on the one hand and merely natural creatures on the other is that the judgments that potentially express knowledge and our intentional doings are things that we're in a distinctive sense responsible for. They express commitments of ours. Those are normative notions. I believe Hegel's great insight is that to understand the nature of that normativity, the way in which it's possible for us to bind ourselves by concepts, we have to think of normative statuses as essentially social statuses. Hegel had the idea that social substance, normative substance, and the self-conscious individuals who become self-conscious by coming to be able to bind themselves by conceptual norms are synthesized by reciprocal recognition. Reciprocal recognition is a matter of my making myself responsible for something, in part by doing something that socially makes it appropriate for others to hold me responsible. And his idea was that the notion of responsibility didn't make sense outside of a context in which others could hold me responsible. I have to be recognized by them as doing something that has that normative significance, and I have to recognize them as able to recognize me in that way in order for me genuinely to be responsible for anything. So I see Kant as having had this fundamental insight into the essentially normative character of human being, and Hegel as having had the insight into the essentially social character of that normativity.
In your interpretation of the dialectic between master and slave, you maintain that the concept of mastery is strongly related to the concept of autonomy. Can you explain better this topic?
Kant distinguished normative constraint from causal compulsion by using a criterion of autonomy that he had developed from the earlier philosopher Rousseau. According to this view, what makes something genuinely normatively binding on me is that I take it to be normatively binding on me. Only I can normatively bind myself, commit myself. Anything that doesn't depend in that way on my acknowledgement of it as authoritative is not normatively authoritative, but is some sort of non-normative compulsion. This was Kant's development of a fundamental Enlightenment idea that normative statuses like authority and responsibility, commitment and entitlement are not part of the non-human world, the pre-human world, or even any supernatural world. They're, in the end, creatures of our normative attitudes. Until people held each other responsible, treated each other as authoritative, as committed, as entitled, there were no such normative statuses. This dependence of normative status on normative attitudes, Kant came to see as one of the great achievements of the Enlightenment, and his notion of autonomy was a development of that. Hegel's discussion of the dialectic of the master and slave is an attempt to show that asymmetric recognitive relations are metaphysically defective, that the norms they institute aren't the right kind to help us think and act with, to make it possible for us to think and act. Asymmetric recognition in this way is authority without responsibility on the side of the master, and responsibility without authority on the side of the slave. And Hegel's argument is that unless authority and responsibility are commensurate and reciprocal, no actual normative statuses are instituted. This is one of his most important and certainly one of his deepest ideas, though it's not so easy to see just how the argument works.
In Hegel's philosophy is central the constitution of the self. The basis of the self is the self-consciousness in the relation with the other self-consciousness. The structure of this relation is for Hegel an historical structure of desire and recognition. In a second stage, from this structure come all the institutions like society, states, right. In which way is this Hegelian conception a pragmatic conception?
One of Hegel's big ideas is that once we've understood from Kant that we're normative beings, that to be a self is to be able to be responsible and authoritative in distinctive ways, in ways that are conceptually articulated, because in cognitive judgment we commit ourselves by applying concepts, committing ourselves as to how things are. In intentional agency, we commit ourselves by applying concepts as to how things are to be. Hegel's idea that once we've understood those normative statuses to be social statuses, we'll see that the notion of self-conscious selves who can apply concepts and take themselves to be applying concepts theoretically and practically, is a fundamentally social achievement. Self-consciousness is not something that happens principally between our ears. It's something that happens between ourselves. It's a social achievement, a matter of reciprocal recognition. I am what I'm recognized to be by those I recognize as having the authority to determine what I really am. I have authority over whom I recognize in that sense, but I'm granting them authority over me in turn. Hegel has a very delicate and sophisticated account of the relation between self-conscious individual selves and the normative recognitive communities that they constitute by their recognitive practical attitudes to one another. This social notion of self-consciousness, this notion of self-consciousness as a fundamentally social achievement because it is fundamentally a normative status, is one of his most important ideas.
Okay, Mr. Brandom, we are very grateful for your interview, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.